Mr. Secretary, I plan to ask you some budget questions about the following: the cost of the Qatar plane, where the money from the Army's parade is coming from, or the National Guard deployments to the border, where that funding is coming from. I honor and celebrate the United States Army, but I'd like to know how much this parade is going to cost. I have sent the department letters on several occasions on this, and I'm still waiting for a response. But then something else happened this weekend, and it needs to be addressed, and that is the President's premature and escalatory decision to deploy not only the National Guard troops to Los Angeles, but active duty Marines as well. Mr. Secretary, we're both from Minnesota. I was in the Twin Cities during the riots that followed the murder of George Floyd. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets for days. Governor Walz made the decision to call up the Minnesota National Guard. At no point did we need the citizens of Minnesota request that the Marines be deployed. Our state and local law enforcement, along with our National Guard, who have worked on crowd control, they were more than enough. They were more than capable of handling this situation.
Let's talk about. Critics argue that the situation in Los Angeles does not mirror the chaos of previous large-scale civil disturbances like the George Floyd protests or the Rodney King riots. In both of those historical instances, local law enforcement and, when necessary, National Guard troops managed the crises. The involvement of active duty military personnel was avoided, primarily to maintain the distinction between civilian policing and military action, which is a foundational principle in democratic societies. This time, however, the decision bypassed local authorities, creating tension between federal and state jurisdictions. Los Angeles County already possesses a robust law enforcement infrastructure with over 17,000 personnel at its disposal, and the state of California has an additional 24,000 National Guard members ready to be activated. These numbers indicate that there is already significant capacity on the ground to handle unrest without needing to bring in federal troops. Even the Los Angeles chief of police voiced concerns, stating that the uncoordinated arrival of federal forces could complicate existing operations and pose logistical and operational challenges. Such a statement from a high-ranking local official underscores the belief that local agencies are capable of managing the situation without interference from federal military forces. Furthermore, the use of Marines in domestic unrest scenarios can have psychological and social consequences. Their presence can escalate tensions, making protesters feel under siege rather than heard, which may lead to further unrest rather than calming the situation. The optics of military force being used against American citizens exercising their First Amendment rights is troubling to many, especially when historical precedent suggests that such heavy-handed measures are rarely necessary. There's also a broader concern about setting a dangerous precedent. If the federal government normalizes the use of active duty military forces for crowd control and domestic protests, it could shift the balance of power away from local governance and undermine the autonomy of state and municipal authorities.
As I mentioned before, in Minnesota, we train for those things together. So there's no need for the Marines to be deployed. So here are my budget questions, though. What is the current cost for what is taking place in California, and how is it going to affect this budget or the budget we're currently serving under? How much are these deployments going to cost for both the Marines and the National Guard? And what training or duties are not taking place because of these deployments? Where in your limited budget, sir, are you going to find, in the remainder of this fiscal year, are you going to pull the money to cover these deployments? What holes are being created?
At the center of this debate is the lack of clear answers from the Department of Defense regarding how these operations, such as the National Guard and Marine deployments to Los Angeles, are being financed. Members of Congress have raised direct and repeated questions about the financial implications of these actions. Despite submitting letters and inquiries, they report receiving no satisfactory responses. This lack of communication from the department only deepens the suspicion and concern about how taxpayer money is being allocated, and whether the funds are being drawn from areas that could compromise military readiness or other essential defense functions. Military deployments, especially those involving both the National Guard and active duty Marines, are extremely costly. These costs include transportation, housing, supplies, and personnel support. In addition, there are hidden opportunity costs. Every hour these troops spend on domestic deployment is time taken away from training and preparation for their primary missions. Lawmakers are especially worried about what duties and training exercises are being delayed or canceled to accommodate these missions. With a finite budget and numerous competing priorities, these reallocations can create long-term gaps in preparedness and performance. In the current fiscal climate, with the Department of Defense already operating under financial pressures, the question arises, from which specific budgetary accounts is the funding for these deployments being pulled? Are the funds being diverted from critical programs like equipment modernization, cybersecurity, or troop support services? Or are they coming from emergency contingency funds that could have been reserved for more critical national security scenarios? These are not theoretical concerns. They are central to how the military maintains operational readiness and fulfills its broader responsibilities. Budgeting for military operations must involve accountability, transparency, and oversight, principles that are fundamental to a functioning democracy. When elected officials ask where the money is coming from, how much has been spent, and what programs are being affected, they deserve honest and complete answers. The fact that such information is not being readily provided undermines trust in the system and creates an impression of evasiveness within the administration.
So in Los Angeles, we believe that ICE, which is a federal law enforcement agency, has the right to safely conduct operations in any state and any jurisdiction in the country, especially after 21 million illegals have crossed our border under the previous administration. ICE ought to be able to do its job, whether it's Minneapolis or Los Angeles.
I have limited time. I asked a budget
And they are
question. Could the Secretary please address the budget? Thank you.
You asked about the situation in Los Angeles, and we believe ICE agents should be allowed to be safe in doing their operations, and we have deployed National Guard and the Marines to protect them in the execution of their duties, because we ought to be able to enforce immigration law in this country, unlike what Governor Walz did in 2020. There are 17,000 LAPD, you mentioned that. There would be 18,000 if not for the defund movement that folks like Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass have implemented. The police chief said she was overwhelmed,
so we helped. If the Secretary is not going to ask the budgetary questions, I will yield back my time if the Secretary refuses to answer the budgetary questions I put before him. They're important. What training missions aren't happening? Where are you pulling the money from, and how are you planning this in the moving forward? These are budget questions that affect this committee and the decisions we're going to be making in a couple of hours. If you're not going to answer them, please let the chairman know, and I will take back my time and I will yield it back to the chairman.
Mr. Secretary, I want to just let us
During
know.
the George Floyd protests in Minnesota, tens of thousands of citizens took to the streets in response to a clear case of racial injustice and police brutality. The demonstrations were emotionally charged, widespread, and lasted several days. Yet even at the height of the unrest, state authorities, led by Governor Tim Walz, called upon the Minnesota National Guard to assist in restoring order. The use of the Guard was viewed as a measured and proportional response. While there were criticisms about the timing and execution, the deployment of active duty federal troops was never considered necessary. The situation, though volatile, was handled by local and state agencies with minimal federal interference, and ultimately stability was restored without invoking broader military action. Similarly, the 1992 Los Angeles riots following the Rodney King verdict were marked by an intense eruption of public outrage, looting, and violence. In that case, the National Guard was again activated to support overwhelmed local police forces. While the president did authorize federal troops eventually, it came only after the governor requested help, and only when it was clear that the situation had spiraled beyond the state's control. Even then, strict rules of engagement were established to ensure that military personnel acted with restraint. The historical lesson was clear. Active duty troops should only be used as a last resort, with full cooperation between state and federal leaders. What makes the current deployment to Los Angeles so different and concerning is that it appears to lack the same justification. The current unrest is being portrayed on continuous media loops, creating an exaggerated sense of crisis. But those on the ground, including law enforcement officials and city leaders, argue that the situation remains manageable with local resources. The deployment of Marines in this context seems out of proportion to the reality on the ground and bypasses established protocols for federal involvement in domestic affairs. This is not just about security, it's about the principles of federalism and democratic accountability. If federal troops are inserted into local situations without coordination or necessity, it undermines the authority of state and local governments. It erodes the trust between communities and their governments and risks escalating tensions rather than resolving them.
They want to just let us know what accounts you're pulling the money to fund.
Thankfully, unlike the previous administration, we've got a 13% increase in our defense budget, and we will have the capability to cover down on contingencies, which is something the National Guard and the Marine plan for. So we have the funding to cover down on contingencies, especially ones as important as maintaining law and order in a major American city. As far as training, all of the units on the ground have been fully trained in their capabilities of what they're executing on the ground.
For budgetary, if he needs to get back to the committee with the numbers, I'd appreciate it, both current and present.
I'm happy to submit them for the record.
Gentlemen will receive an answer to the question